Dennis, how you going?
Jeff, how are you? It's nice to have you back on the podcast.
No, it's a pleasure.
Now, we last chatted with you in October of last year. At the time, you'd released Friday on My Mind, your publication on George Young. We've previously chatted about both Malcolm and Angus Young. Bon Scott is the subject, of course, of this current publication. With quite a few books already out there on Bon, was there any specific angle or objective you had in mind for this title, and do you think you've achieved that?
Yeah, look, I mean, I'll be honest, the motivation was the simple fact that this is what I do for my livelihood. And I had a publisher who was keen, who actually came to me with the idea of doing something about Bon. I think it might have been the anniversary of his death. For some reason, he was back. There was people talking about him again. But for me as a writer, what bothered me a little bit is that over the last decade or so, a lot of discussion about Bon seems to be about how he died. You know, was he on drugs? Was heroin involved? Blah, blah, blah. And I have zero interest in that because I'm interested in how he lived. You know, I'm really, I found there's this imbalance starting to develop. The talk seemed to be all about, what happened at the end. But if he hadn't have lived this short, sharp, amazing life that he did, we wouldn't be talking about the guy at all. So I tried to really focus on that and not dwell so much on the end of his life. But I also wanted to really shine a light on the fact that I think this guy was genuinely funny. You know, he wrote, while he certainly pushed the boundaries when it came to, well, it wasn't called political correctness back then, but, male-female relationships, I think, Dennis, is the best way to put it. He pushed the boundary there, and sometimes he buggered up and overstepped the mark. But I think he was genuinely funny. I think he was wanted, and that's what separated him from a lot of his peers at the time, is that, as a lyricist and as a frontman, he knew how to entertain an audience, and that's not as easy as it sounds. So I wanted to really shine a light on that, and I was just really lucky. Mary Renshaw, who was a good friend of Bon's, who'd written her own book about Bon called Livewire, which is really worth reading. She shared some letters with me. I was talking to her. She was a friend of Mark Evans, who I'd worked with in the past, and she said, here, have a look at these. You can use them, feel free. And they helped to reveal that, to emphasize that funnier side, the more humorous side of Bon that I was really trying to drive home in the book. So hopefully, and the people who knew him well, who read the book before it was published, said that I came pretty close to capturing that aspect of the guy, which was such a big part of his personality. So, I was really pleased with that because, like I said, I've had, I'm not sure if it's a misfortune, Dennis, but I've written about a lot of dead white rockers, and it's easy to fall into the trap of really harking on the end, the demise, because quite often it's, unfortunate and it's premature. And it certainly was Bon's case, but I'm much more interested in writing about how they lived.
Jeff, we kicked this show off with an obvious song choice being Bad Boy Boogie from the Let There Be Rock album. Yet another song that showcases Bon's lyrical strength and storytelling, if you will. I've assumed over the years that this track was Bon's summary of a promiscuous road life, but I've also read that there's a little nod to Angus in there with that lyric, it was the seventh day, I was the seventh son, and Angus was indeed the seventh son of the Young family. A bit of both, you reckon?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and in Problem Child as well. I think Problem Child might have been Bon giving Angus a bit of a nod as well. So, while a lot of Bon's lyrics and songs were autobiographical and with the emphasis on graphic, I think, occasionally he gave his bandmates a nod. Him and Angus had that. I really enjoyed writing about that relationship because it's just so odd. They're like rock and roll odd couple to me. There's Bon, this hedonist, a guy whose idea of an after party is one that runs for about a week. And there's Angus, a teetotaler who plays the gig and disappears back to his hotel room to keep playing his guitar. And, his biggest indulgence is cigarettes and spaghetti bolognese. They seem like really unlikely characters, but you put them together on stage, man, some magic happens. It's amazing to watch.
Well, just going on from that, what I like about this publication, Jeff, is it gives quite a bit of attention to Bon pre-AC/DC. I mean, there's a big 10-year period, 64 to 74, which not a lot of people know about, which covers his time with the Spektors, the Valentines, and, of course, Fraternity.
Yeah, it's the longest musical apprenticeship in Australian history, I think. He said it himself, I'm a three-time, before he joined AC/DC, or when the the opportunity came up to join the band, he said, "Hey, I'm a 3-time loser. It better work," because I think at the time that he sort of muscled his way into to Dave Evans' position in AC/DC. He was just about to accept a job working in a factory in Adelaide. He'd just about given up.
Mm.
And it's a really interesting journey because those bands are so. If you listen to their music and Bond's role with those bands, it's so unlike how we know him through AC/DC. The Valentines came out of that kind of bubblegum teen pop era of the late 60s. And mind you, I don't think they did some pretty good Vander and Young covers, I think. They had a crack at Peculiar Hole in the Sky, which is not an easy song, and it's certainly not a throwaway pop song. I think it's a great psychedelic song.
It is. I don't think, they often get filed straight under the bubblegum tag, but if you think of that track, Peculiar Hole in the Sky, very much highlights what they were capable of.
Yeah, totally. They bought into the image. They had the kind of bodgy homemade haircuts, and they all wore the red satin matching outfits, and they certainly played to that teenage female audience. But I think they had some chops. They were good players, and they were sort of heading in an interesting direction. And they also had the distinction of being the first Australian band to be very publicly busted for dope, which, there's a claim to fame, Dennis.
Jeff, Bond's working relationship with both Harry Vander and George Young is an interesting relationship which most folks don't give too much attention to. If you think about it, they were all the same age, and most just assume their relationship was one of musician and producers. However, their friendship, as you just mentioned, went back a number of years, didn't it, with the Valentines supporting and befriending the Easy Beats. And from memory, I think there is one of those early singles called She Said, which was a George Young, Stevie Wright composition.
Yeah. It's worth noting, too, that, Bond was closer in age to George and Harry than he was to the guys in AC/DC. They didn't look at him so much as a big brother, but more like a, wacky uncle. And, I think that legend has it that George hadn't seen a lot of Bond between the era of the Valentines and the time that he joined AC/DC. And, Bond had done a few yards, I think is the best way of describing it. I think the comment is, geez, he looks like he's been around the block a few times. And, of course, in that period, he'd had that terrible bike crash in Adelaide and almost died. And, he'd been through the mill. And, Fraternity had come and gone, and they had that UK Odyssey that failed. And, Von had certainly done more than one lap of the block. But I think it was important for AC/DC, particularly once they got into the studio, that it sort of broke down those barriers. It's always difficult being a fledgling band going into a studio, and imagine, being a band like AC/DC and having to work with, Harry and George from the Easy Beats. Thank God they were family, because it would have been a pretty daunting proposition for any band that wasn't connected to them, because they were such heavyweights in the Australian music industry. But, it helped, I think, really helped it make those early records probably a lot easier to record. And it also, let's face it, whenever any conflict came up, it's always easy to tell someone to get stuffed who and particularly, in the case of Angus and Malcolm, when it's their brother, it's a lot easier to get through bickering and sort yourselves out and move on than it is with someone you don't know. So, it was probably a very big advantage for them. And, George said it as soon as Bond joined, and particularly once he started writing lyrics and recording with the band, he said, "That's your guy. You are so fortunate to find him because he's just perfect for what you're doing."
And incidentally, Jeff, and you know how I like to pull out the obscure fact or two, and this is a 70s rugby league tie-in which I discovered. Peculiar Hole in the Sky was produced by Pat Alton. Pat, for much of the 60s and 70s, produced work for many Australian artists such as Normie Rowe and Jeff St John, among others. He was the in-house producer at Festival Records in Sydney and did a whole bunch of stuff. But in 1979, under the moniker Pat Alton and the Fatrick Band, he recorded and produced the single The Greatest Game of All. So there you go, Jeff. I've managed a rugby league and rock and roll tie-in. Back when, in my opinion, it really was. Back when it really was the greatest game of all, by the way.
Yeah, well, I've written a book about football coaches, so, I'm a big fan. I mean, I despair at rugby league these days. It's not like back in the days of the Fibros and the Silvertails.
No, it's all it's lost on me now. But, mate, it's safe to say, and you just alluded to Bond's motorcycle crashes, it is safe to say that Bond danced with danger throughout much of his life, but his love of motorcycles very nearly ended his life, didn't it? One nasty crash in Adelaide in 1974, which he wrote about, even put him in a coma. And going on from that, in 2014, the driver of the other vehicle involved in that crash gave an interview with the Adelaide Advertiser, which gave an indication of the severity and force of the crash. Bon, in fact, went through the windscreen and the car was written off.
Wow, really? I didn't know that. Now, that's really interesting because the only time, the Youngs never did, particularly once post Back in Black, they did very few interviews. And even when I was working at Rolling Stone, I managed to interview Angus just once, and it was around the year 2000. And he said to me, because, inevitably talk turns to the Bon era and Bon himself, and he said, Bon used to swim with the sharks. And now I thought he meant metaphorically, like, Bon took big bites, he flew close to the sun, every day was Saturday night, that kind of thing. But he was speaking literally. As I found out, Bon used to work in a crayfishing boat and used to jump in the drink, not really caring about what was in the water at the time. So it sort of worked on two levels. I thought that's really an interesting comment because, on the broader scale, Bon certainly did swim with the sharks. But in his early days, this guy was fearless. He was kind of, I think he considered himself bulletproof, as most young, cocky young men do, particularly someone with a lot of swagger like Bon. And, as you say, geez, that bike crash nearly ended him. But, then in this kind of, simple twist of fate, there he is working with Vince Lovegrove, putting up posters, and he sees one that says AC/DC. And, that led to, I think, 5.5 years of musical magic. I mean, imagine if he wasn't there and if he hadn't recovered in time for them to be in town, we wouldn't be talking about him.
From what I read, the driver, Jeff, who was 17 at the time and actually had fraternity posters on his bedroom wall, got sent a writ in 1977 for $20,000 for Bon's restriction on stage. His restriction on stage due to his injuries sustained in that crash. So obviously Bon carried injuries which not a lot of fan ever knew about from that crash.
You are so going on my research team, Dennis. That's fantastic. I had no idea.
Yeah.
So he was restricted physically. He still carried he obviously had physical scars, but he carried other types of physical scars that restricted his movements. You wouldn't know so from watching him, though, would you?
No, that's still available online to read from the Adelaide Advertiser. I'll send you the link after we get off the phone.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting because, if I hadn't, I certainly didn't know it. And if you look at him in his performance, right through his career with AC/DC, even when he reached, the ripe old age of 33, he was moving great. He was just, a ball of energy on stage. So to think that he was carrying, much more than an injury, it wasn't like some passing thing by the sounds of it. That's remarkable. Yeah.
I learnt from your book, Jeff, that when the Dave Everett's fronted AC/DC supported Lou Reed on his 1974 Australian tour, Bon was in fact in the audience at that 17th of August Festival Hall concert watching on. It's fascinating to think that some 6 or so weeks later he'd be fronting that AC/DC lineup in Sydney, which would include a Black Sabbath support at the Hordern Pavilion in November. Things moved quite rapidly for Bon once he'd slotted in.
Yeah, and look, the young names certainly opened a lot of doors for AC/DC because, they got the Lou Reed support, they got Black Sabbath, they paid festival bills and so on, and it was incredibly handy for them. And when I was working with Michael Browning on his book, really great memoir, Dog Eat Dog, he said that, this is 73, 74, and he's talking to Michael Chugg, they're both fledgling promoters, and Chugg says, I'm bringing this band down from Sydney. They're brothers, they're brothers of George Young from the Easy Beats. And Michael himself said, right, I'm booking them in, at the Hard Rock Cafe. I'm having them. So that was sort of the attitude of a lot of promoters in Australia because, like I said earlier, George's name, that was Aussie music royalty. So it really helped open a few doors and helped certainly fast-track AC/DC. But it was, it wasn't like they didn't have the songs and they didn't have the potential, and the material and just that, ability on stage because when I was writing about Malcolm and Angus, Malcolm in particular, I really wasn't aware of the apprenticeship that he'd served too. It was, with the Velvet Underground. It wasn't 10 years like Bon, but it was a couple of years of hard grind where I think he really, found his playing style, I guess, and also learned about what was required to make it in a up and coming rock and roll band. So, there was a lot of that went in. A lot of stuff happened before AC/DC exploded to, pretty much everybody in the band. And, Bon was obviously the most experienced, but each of them brought sort of their own respective journey with them, if that makes sense. And, to think of them, they were a new band, certainly, and they were only, 6 months old when Bon joined, 7 months old, something like that. But they all sort of carried their own, a little bit of baggage into the band, a little bit of experience that really helped them. And, they outgrew the Brothers of George Young tag pretty quickly.
Jeff, people tend to forget that Countdown was extremely important in the band's early days. They made numerous appearances on the show. I think you mentioned 40-odd appearances in your book. Sadly, those tapes were wiped over. And I guess this is a conversation for another time, but the Sunday evening TV exposure for bands like AC/DC, when you think back on it now, really was incredible and unprecedented.
Yeah.
Breaking the band into regional centres away from Sydney and Melbourne.
That was the thing. I mean, it was certainly the first exposure I got was as a teenager watching Countdown. I think probably when they played Baby Please Don't Go. I think, one of those early performances, and thinking, because of course I was desperately trying to be the coolest teenager on the block, and my friends and I were all into Lou Reed and Bowie and Dylan and Neil Young, and, trying to be cooler than anybody else on the block. But the reality was we'd all seen that and gone, oh, they're great. These guys are fantastic. And you had to watch Countdown, as corny as it sometimes was. And, it had its fair share of cheesy pop, but you sort of snuck away on Sunday night. You wouldn't watch it collectively because that was uncool. But I certainly would duck home to make sure I was home at, 6 o'clock on Sunday to make sure I caught every episode, particularly the Countdown. You had to know what was in the charts. So, but its spread was huge. There'd been a lot of rock and roll shows before, 6 O'Clock Rock and Uptight and GTK and all those programs, but no one had the reach of Countdown. And also remember, too, with Countdown, another big thing, it started to one of the first shows to broadcast in colour. It was only, half a dozen episodes or so in that it started broadcasting in colour, and that was huge. Colour suited AC/DC, Bon in all his outfits, Angus in all the outfits that he got from the ABC costume department, and it really, really helped, as you say, make them known from one end of the country to the other, which was sort of very unlikely and very uncommon in the past. You could be huge in Melbourne and unknown in Brisbane. And I'm not sure if I quoted it in the book, but there's certainly one of my favourite stories about that. Herm Kovac from TMG told me this story. He said, we were at our Countdown peak and we got the opportunity to play some shows up at the top end. And we'd never been there, and we just thought this is going to be a great trip, a really interesting experience. Never been to the Northern Territory, certainly never been to, such far-flung part of Australia. And he said, and we just booked into all these town halls, they were kind of small-scale things. And he said, we turned up to the first show, and there's hundreds of people there. And we were just absolutely gobsmacked. We had no idea. And Herm asked one of the locals, and he looked at him and said, mate, we've got Countdown up here, He just walked away. So, its reach was undeniable. And Molly Meldrum, for all his, quirks, was a true spokesman for Australian music. He really was. I mean, he doesn't quite get the raps he deserves. And hey, this is the guy who produced the real thing too. He had a pretty good track record, but was a huge spokesman and loved AC/DC. And I think some of the interplay, if you look at some of the interviews that do exist of him and Bon, the interplay between them is great because Bon just loves winding him up. And you could see Molly, he's working with this fantastic, funny guy, and you can see he's trying his best to keep up. But Bon's just got him. Bon's got it all over him, and it makes for great TV. Bon understood showbiz. I'm not sure he's given his dues in that regard, too, that he understood, you had to put on a bit of razzmatazz to win people over. And Countdown was the perfect vehicle for that.
Not a lot of fans know that AC/DC's road crew in those early days of 74, 75 contained a hardworking 16-year-old girl named Tana Douglas, who has been recognised as the world's first female roadie. Tana spent 4 decades in the industry, and her story is a fascinating one. I know that she's just released her memoir titled Loud, which I have yet to read, but another fascinating piece to the early AC/DC puzzle there, Jeff. Yeah. I'm really, I spoke to Tana. I started talking to her, 4 or 5 years ago, and a mutual friend who lives near her in the States actually met her and said, you've got to write your memoir. So
we had a little role in motivating her to do that. And yeah, it's a great story. Again, it's one of these really unlikely stories. I think there was, some big beefy bloke drove the truck, and there was Tana, who's straight out of a private girls' school up in Brisbane, who went from, I'm pretty sure she was, kind of drawn into the age of Aquarius, a bit of a hippie, and yet somehow found herself working with AC/DC. And, held her own, she really did. And she was, I think she was on stage in Sunbury when they had the big punch-up. And, she was, she never took a backward step. And I think she was a pretty important part of those early days of AC/DC.
Just going on from that, Jeff, one person who I think deserves great recognition for documenting early AC/DC and Australian rock and roll is Philip Morris. You've got his quote on the front of the book, which says, "This reveals Bon as I knew him, a man of the people, a street poet, a larrikin, love it." I mean, without him and his camera, a lot of this history would just be lost, wouldn't it?
Yeah, look, I'm proud to consider myself a good friend of Philip. We catch up a couple of times a year, and often we've done quite a few events. We've actually got one coming up, hopefully, in November up on the Central Coast in New South Wales. It's I was approached to do something about my work, and I said, no, I want to host an event with Philip as the focus. So we're going to do a slideshow night, in a big town hall with a couple of hundred people. So it's going to be great. And he's contributed to, probably my last 7 or 8 books. He contributed the cover shot for my John English book and a whole bunch of photos. And every time, I contact him and say, hey, what do you got on X? He'll find something, whatever the band is from that era, say from 67 to about late 70s, maybe even into the early 80s. Phil's got some shot you've never seen before, some great photo. Like he did the head injuries cover shot for Midnight Oil. And I even found out the other day that he did the cover shot for Norman Gunston's Nylon Degrees, his
wow.
piss take of Boz Scaggs. Yeah, right. So, Phil's been everywhere. And, again, I was watching something with Norman Gunston and Paul McCartney for some reason, and spoke to Phil, and he said, oh, yeah, that's me in the background. I actually told Paul McCartney beforehand to, what Norman Gunston was all about, so he was prepared. I'm thinking, wow, Phil's a guy who just doesn't play up his role, lets his work speak for itself, and it's such an important part of Australian rock and roll history. The guy's he's a titan. He really is, and his work's fantastic. And even, again, last time we spoke, we were talking about Lillian Roxon, the rock journalist, probably the first renowned female rock journalist who went to from Melbourne, went to New York, set herself up there, played a big hand in the careers of people like Helen Reddy and Peter Allen. And Philip said he went to New York and met with her, and she took him to Max's Kansas City and the Factory. And this is in the early 70s. Can you imagine going to those? Yeah, these are places that I just read about and dream about. And Phil's been there. So, yeah. But like I say, he's a very understated guy, very modest, very humble, but his work's fantastic. So, actually, I will send you some info on that event when it comes up. Dennis, maybe put it up on the site, because I think people would love to go and check it out.
Love to. And it would be remiss of me to not mention Bob King as well. Those two guys are just wonderful photographers who have documented so much of Australian music history. We touched on this earlier, Jeff, but one observation I've noted over the years was how prolific a letter writer Bon was. Many of those letters and postcards he sent to fans, friends and family members, some of these are printed in the book. They offer a great insight into his world and what he may have been dealing with at that time, don't they?
Yeah, they really do, in a more kind of soulful, sensitive side of the guy. He still, having said all that, he did sign off his Christmas cards, Jingle Balls. He couldn't resist it. But there are certain moments in those letters where, and it's not grandstanding, you never really find him boasting about what AC/DC had achieved. It was more like, are you going to be home at Christmas? How's the family? Love to catch up. How have you been? How's X, Y, and Z? He was, I wouldn't say he had a huge circle of friends, but those that he was close to, he kept really, really close, including, his ex-wife. Bon was a terrible husband. He was only married for about, a heartbeat. But his relationship with Irene Thornton continued way beyond that, and they were close right up until the end. So, and those letters really, as much as his lyrics express one side of him, the letters, I thought, revealed yet another side of the guy. Like I say, just a much more thoughtful, considerate, almost chivalrous in some ways. Herm Kovac told me a story which I relate in the book. Bond's played a show with AC/DC, and he's come off stage and he's dripping sweat and he's exhausted, and frankly, all the guy wants is a towel and a beer and somewhere to lie down. And Herm's there, and hey, Bond, how you going? And Herm had I think a girlfriend at the time with him, and Bond just said, "Hang on," before he did anything else, went and found her a chair. Which I just think is remarkable. Could you imagine Axl Rose doing that? It's not going to happen. And, that to me was further proof of the stuff that is revealed in those letters. So this is a guy with actually quite a sensitive soul. It was one side. There was a lot of sides to Bond, but that was one particularly strong one, I think.
Jeff, we will never know what the 1980s and beyond held for Bon Scott. There was talk of a solo project, and when I chatted with Mark Evans some time back, he had confirmed that and stated, the last two times I was with him, he was very set in his ways. He wanted to do it. It would have made for a very interesting band meeting with AC/DC, that one when he said he wanted to do a solo album. It's something he dearly wanted to do, but it definitely wasn't the time to do it. He'd got so far as he'd picked a few people out who he'd wanted to play on it, the solo album, and he'd spoken to a couple of guys from Lynyrd Skynyrd that wanted to work on it with him. I know that he also got on really well with bass player Leon Wilkinson. That was the guy who he had probably closest to in Lynyrd Skynyrd. I know he would have had Leon in mind. He did have Leon in mind. Pretty interesting there, Jeff.
Well, absolutely. And if Bond had been around for Back in Black, that would have given him, although the Youngs would have been a bit resistant to it for sure, it would have given him probably the latitude, at least with his record companies, to do it. And, it's remarkable. I've been thinking a lot about this. Bond would have turned 75 recently, and if he'd survived, would he have done the Mick Jagger thing? Would he have hung around? R.I.P. Charlie Watts, by the way. But, would he still be playing in this version of AC/DC that still exists? And, I sort of doubt it. I think he would have probably seen it as being a bit comical, turning into a bit of a cartoon. I don't think he really would have gone the distance. I think he would have, I tell you what though, I still think Back in Black would have been a much better album with Bon out front, because I just, I'm not a Brian Johnson fan. I think he's done a good job over the last 40 years. He's hung around and he's done what was required, but as a lyricist, he's not a match on Bon. Bon would go beyond double entendre, get into triple entendre. And I think Brian Johnson struggles to come up with single entendres. And, he gave up lyric writing, of course. A few years back, he just couldn't do it anymore. And so what would have happened to Bon? I think he would have hung in there for a while longer, but I think once the band exploded and he had the financial freedom to do what he wanted, I have the suspicion he might have gone his own way. Don't you? What do you reckon, Dennis?
Look, it's a mystery, isn't it? But I am going to close with, for as much as Bon had achieved the status of rock and roll legend, his story, Jeff, is also one of sadness and tragedy, and people tend to forget that Bon was someone's son, he was someone's brother, and he had worked so hard for such a long time and didn't get to enjoy the rewards that were to come. And as you write in the book's final paragraph, within 18 months of Bond's death, AC/DC would be the biggest rock and roll band on the planet. A very poignant way to close out the book.
Yeah, a bit of pill, isn't it? I mean, obviously his early death is a tragedy, but the other great tragedy is he's a guy who's worked since, the mid-60s, 15 years, and played thousands of gigs, travelled possibly millions of miles, done everything in his power to get, because he was very ambitious, that's not to be overlooked with Bon. He was as driven as Malcolm and Angus were about to become, the biggest rock and roll band in the world, and he's just about there. Highway to Hell was just exploding, and it all came to an untimely end. So, that's part of the big tragedy. But his legacy has been, I think, Bond's legacy has been really well maintained. I think the fact that people, I've written a book about him as of other people, and we're still talking about him 40 years later. Someone asked me at the end, I closed the book with that Highway to Hell, the big celebration in Perth. I think it was back in 2019, 2018, where the Perth Festival closed with this amazing event with hundreds of thousands of people lining the streets and all these bands. And someone asked me, what do you reckon Bond would have said if he was there? And I'm convinced he would have stood there, crossed his arms and said, yeah, about bloody time. it's funny. I don't do social media anymore, and that's another conversation for another day. But someone told me that someone said something about my book. Another case of Bondsploitation, and I'm thinking, if Bond was alive, he'd love this attention. He'd revel in it. He's thinking, hey, I'm 75 years old and people are still writing about me and talking about me and, recording songs and making documentaries. I think he would have absolutely reveled in that. So, maybe he's here in spirit somewhere. You never know, Dennis. I sometimes get the feeling he's looking over your shoulder, I think Angus probably feels that too every time he plugs into play. I think he's got Malcolm over one shoulder and Bon over the other.
Mate, we could talk forever about Bon and AC/DC, but we should finish up. Thank you once again for coming on the podcast. The book is called Bad Boy Boogie, The True Story of AC/DC legend Bon Scott. I think it holds enormous appeal for any music fan, and I know that AC/DC disciples are also going to want to get hold of this too. There's lots and lots to learn in these pages about Bon, his life, legacy, and indeed the AC/DC story. I will give all the ordering details at the end of this show. Father's Day has just gone, but Christmas is just around the corner, and I reckon Bad Boy Boogie would make a great gift for those who wish to start their shopping lists early. Jeff, as you may know from your previous appearances, every guest on our show gets to choose a song by an Australian band, something which is significant. What would you like to choose and why?
Ooh, can you finish? Let me think. How about Riff Raff? There's a song that's going to blow out the cobwebs of anybody who's listening to the show.
Great. Wonderful. We'll close out with that.
Excellent.
Mate, stay safe, keep in touch. Good luck with the book and for the remainder of the year.
Thanks, Dennis. Always a pleasure, mate.